So then consider 100 grams serving of typical dry brown rice cereal instant baby food. It packs a solid 75 grams of carbohydrate. And I'm going to show you that the human body does not need 1 gram of carbohydrate from the exogenous, i.e. from outside the body, to survive. You don't need 1 gram. And so now we expose children to 75 grams of a substance that they do not need, with 7.5 grams of protein and only 2.5 grams of fat. And it comes with a mere fraction of the vitamins and minerals that are present in liver, sardines, and eggs, table 2. And the same applies to white rice, only more so. And to confirm our position, we did an analysis of sardines, liver, eggs, and white rice and brown rice, and published it in the page in the book on the table that comes up next. But what we have here is this is for 100 grams of product: chicken liver, sardines, eggs, sunflower seeds, and kale. So these are the 5 nutrients. That's all you need to eat. If you eat those foods, you will get a balanced diet, which is quite remarkable. And so each of these foods is chosen because it has something that the others don't have. But the reality, we're not going to worry about sunflower seed and kale, but kale is the most potent vegetable, apart from seaweed probably. And sunflower seeds are packed with omega-6 fats. So that's, and you can see here some of the high in magnesium, high in phosphorus. So that's why they score. But these are the animal-based foods that are really high in nutrients: chicken, liver, sardines, and eggs. And one of the points is those are cheap foods. And so people say that to have a nutrient-dense diet, it has to be expensive. That's not true. You can base it on that. And that's the diet of the Eat Better South Africa campaign, is we're focusing on these nutrient-dense foods. So when we compare then, on the next slide, we add white rice and brown rice. But if you look at white rice, all you see is a row of noughts. And these, where you see the in bold, that's the food that has the highest content of those nutrients. And you can see that white rice and brown rice, only brown rice has a bit more magnesium than anything else, but otherwise it's pretty nutrient poor. Look at this. Brown rice has just a whole bunch of zeros. So to say that this is a nutrient-dense food is simply misleading the public. And anyone who's ever said that either hasn't read the literature, or I can't imagine why they would say that cereals and grains are nutrient-dense. And here are some other, just while we're talking about it, some popular fruits and vegetables. And we're often told that apples are healthy and bananas are healthy. But again, do you see how and oranges? With few exceptions, they're nutrient poor. And that's a really important point to make, that fruits are not full of the nutrients we're told they are. And if you want to get nutrient-dense foods, you wouldn't include fruit as a constituent of the diet. You would include the vegetables that are nutrient-dense, like kale. But my point being that we will address, where did the idea come that we must eat 5 servings of fruit and vegetable a day? And we'll come to that in due course, because it's not scientifically based. So I'm again now going to continue on what is written in the book. So again, to confirm that this is what appears in Raising Superheroes. And now we focus on what happens if you raise children on these bland foods. What happens in the long term? How does their food preference develop? So research in the past decade has shown that infants raised on bland-tasting, colorless, textureless meals, and those are those little cereal-based foods, develop a preference for these beige foods. Thus, children raised on diets containing rusk, processed cereals, and milk were found to be more likely to prefer white bread, plain pasta, potato chips, and milk as they aged. And I don't think anyone would have any difficulty saying this is not a balanced, healthy diet. But where was it developed? It was developed because that's the type of food that children were raised on. In part, this is because infants learn that these processed foods are food. It's really interesting. What? They're not. Those are not real foods. While other more colorful foods seem foreign and even non-food-like. In contrast, infants fed a wide range of colorful textured foods were more likely to show an interest and preference for these foods in their adolescence. So that's the evidence that if you determine the child's bias towards foods they consider to be foods by what you wean them onto. And then we come back to the book that I've discussed before, Inventing Baby Food by Amy Bentley. And I quote from her with more information to support what I've just said. So she concurs, and this is in the book, but I'm quoting her. Feeding infants foods such as bland, highly processed rice cereals, its critics argue, put them on the pathway to a lifetime of consumption of highly processed, unhealthy calories, which is one cause of the rising rates of obesity, overweight, obesity, and related diseases such as diabetes. I'm going to introduce you to a clinical professor of pediatrics at Stanford, Dr. Alan Greene. And it's not Professor Noakes saying this, it's Professor Greene. It's very important that we should make that distinction. That I don't have any gripe against white rice cereal, I just give you the facts and you listen. But he has made it his mission to address this question. So, the movement against white rice cereal as the staple infant food in the US has been led by a clinical professor of pediatrics at Stanford. Stanford, remind you, one of the top 4 or 5 best universities in the world. Dr. Alan Greene has labeled it junk food. Greene argues that white rice cereal is a nutritionally deficient food that programs the infant to seek foods that are equally highly processed and nutritionally incomplete and usually high in sugar and refined carbohydrates. And then he says the following: Dr. Greene believes that white rice cereal can predispose to obesity, and he expands on this without equivocation in a way to grab the attention of those who recognize the dangers of sugar. In fact, I think white rice cereal is the taproot of the child obesity epidemic. The problem is that it's basically like feeding kids a spoonful of sugar. So that's what he relates, the white rice to sugar. Might as well just eat sugar. I'm saying you might as well be putting soda in a bottle as feeding the white rice cereal. It would be soda with added vitamins and added iron, but yeah, that's what you're doing. And I think it's time we started realizing that these foods that we might be encouraging our children to wean on, that's what they are. They're simply carbohydrates which have very poor nutritional value in a society which doesn't need any more carbohydrates. We need to wean our children onto real foods so that they get a taste for real foods, and that therefore they will continue to eat real foods for life, and they'll understand that processed foods are not ideal for humans. And I just want to again make the point, and we're going to come to this, that Professor Forrester is a co-author of this paper with Jim Mann, who was from the University of Cape Town, in fact taught me nutrition, and he was the guy who put me on the high carbohydrate diet, so I don't thank him very much for it, but nevertheless I've changed my opinion, he hasn't. So this is his opinion. He's one of the co-authors of this. And he says carbohydrates are the principal energy source in the diets of most people, having a special role to play in energy metabolism and homeostasis. And I completely disagree with that statement. I don't think that that's at all the case. Carbohydrates are only the principal energy source if you eat them. If you don't eat them, fats become the principal energy source. And that is the natural condition of the human in our evolution, was to use fat as the main fuel. But as soon as you ingest carbohydrates, you secrete insulin and you inhibit fat oxidation. You become a carbohydrate burner. The natural state of humans are to be fat burners. And it's only because we live in this environment that is so carbohydrate intensive that we've changed our biology to becoming carbohydrate burners. But this, as I will show you, is completely wrong. Once you take humans off carbohydrates, they become fat burners, and fat provides 80 or 85% of all their energy. And that's even more, I suspect, than carbohydrates in people who eating a lot of carbohydrate. So this statement is entirely dependent on his own view that carbohydrates are crucial for health. So he only looks at populations who eat high carbohydrate diets. And the movement to the low carbohydrate diet has shown that there's a completely different biology, that once you take carbohydrates out of the diet, humans revert back to the traditional way we're designed to burn energy, and we burn fat. So we eat fat, we store it, we burn it, and that's the cycle. And when you eat carbohydrates, you convert that and you inhibit the fat use, you become a fat storing animal and a carbohydrate burning animal. So that statement, in my view, is not helpful. The other paper written by Professor Forrester, and I'm going to start focusing on the grains. And this is going to address a really interesting question about how do you prove that something's good for you. And I'm going to spend a whole lecture on that soon. And there are two studies that you can do. You can do observational studies where you look at a population and you see what they're eating and you then assess their health, or you do intervention trials. And the intervention trials we accept are the way you really find truth. And let's just look at the basis for the evidence that cereals and grains are good for you. And then we're going to look at the randomized controlled trials where people are fed starchy foods like cereals and grains to see what the outcome is. In other words, if cereals and grains are so healthy for me, what happens if I eat more? And there's a whole series of papers because they conflict absolutely with the guidelines that cereals and grains are healthy for us. They completely reverse that opinion. So Professor Forrester says all food groups contribute to dietary adequacy. And I would say that's not true. I would say that whole grains don't contribute to dietary adequacy. How can they? Because they're nutrient deficient. I would say animal products, yes, contribute to dietary adequacy. I'd say vegetables contribute, but I'm not sure about cereals and grains. So, however, carbohydrates from whole grains and minimally processed foods should be the principal energy source in the diet. But why should that be if whole grains are not nutrient-dense foods? So what you're getting is a lot of energy, but no nutrient density, and that doesn't make sense to me. So these foods also provide many other substances such as fiber and micronutrients that are necessary for adequate nutrition. Fiber perhaps, but not micronutrients. We've looked at it. The grains don't provide lots of micronutrients. And then in South Africa, the staples maize, meal, and white and brown bread flour have been fortified with several micronutrients. Again, why have they been fortified? Because they aren't nutrient dense. We've shown you liver is nutrient dense. We've showed you sardines are nutrient dense. Offal is nutrient dense, but cereals and grains aren't. So we're dressing up a food and claiming more for it than it deserves. And now I'm going to move on to suggest that, in fact, cereals and grains as they are today, the way they've been modified, and it's not just genetic modification, it's the way they've been bred today are quite different than the cereals and grains we were eating even 60 years ago. But I'm going to focus on the evidence that cereals and grains produce specific abnormalities in humans, and that we cannot give dietary guidelines that said everyone must eat cereals and grains, because they're completely wrong. And in my view, just as too much carbohydrate causes ill health, in my view, that too much gluten causes ill health, and I'll show you exactly the mechanisms and introduce you to the scientist who I hope one day will win a Nobel Prize for showing this work. So there's the question of should we be eating all the cereals and grains? So has the promotion of 5 to 11 servings of cereals and grains per day led to an increase in autoimmune and other conditions, especially non-celiac gluten intolerance? So this is something that is becoming apparent more by the day, and I'm proud to say I knew nothing about this until I went into the low carbohydrate and started reading the websites of different people and learnt about this condition called the leaky gut syndrome, which I was not taught in medical school. I suspect it's not taught in medical schools. And it's fundamentally important to understand. So a couple of people out there are writing books which are causing a lot of irritation. And we heard from the complainants experts that we shouldn't be reading this book called Grain Brain by David Perlmutter and Wheat Belly by William Davis, and this book, which they didn't discover, but which I've shown. So Dr. David Perlmutter is a neuroscientist whose father was a neurosurgeon who developed Alzheimer's disease. And he began to wonder what was linked to Alzheimer's disease. And he's come up with the idea that grains actually cause brain death and Alzheimer's disease. It's early. There isn't enough evidence to prove him correct, but nevertheless, he's gone out there, and this book was widely read and has become important. And William Davis believes that wheat is addictive, and I'm not going to suggest I agree with him in any way, but he's a cardiologist who also uses the low carbohydrate diet to treat his patients with the metabolic syndrome and heart disease. And this again is a New York Times bestseller. And then Anthony Colpo was the first person I've seen to actually go and look at the evidence that whole grains make you healthy, and looked at all the scientific studies. So that's the book that he wrote. And so that's where some of my information comes from. And so these are the unforeseen consequences of high cereal grain intakes. And this information, I think, really has evolved in the last 10 years or so. And so it's understandable why it's not yet mainstream medical practice. But I'm going to show you that this comes from Harvard Medical School, which is one of the top medical schools in the world. And it's maybe unconventional, but the evidence is really exciting. So in his book, Dr. William Davis says the following: the gliadin protein of wheat gluten, present in all forms of wheat, from spongy Wonder Bread to the coarsest organic multigrain loaf, has the unique ability to make your intestine permeable. And that's really interesting, because this is the leaky gut syndrome. So recent research has fingered wheat gliadin as the trigger of intestinal release of zonulin, a regulator of intestinal permeability. It's all very complex, but I'm going to show it to you because this is hard science. This is at the cutting edge of medicine. And if this man is correct, it's going to change the future of medicine in a way that we can't conceive. So this is Dr. Lesya Fasano of the Harvard Medical School. And he came from Italy, and he was interested in celiac disease and came to Harvard to study it, and has become the world authority on this condition. And he was able to show through his own research that wheat gluten or gliadin causes the leaky gut syndrome in everyone. It's just worse in some than others. And the more your genes are different, and where you have celiac disease, then it's a really serious condition. The rest of us, it's practically relatively minor. So this man it might take him 20 years to get the Nobel Prize, but it's astonishing because he's also bringing a whole bunch of different diseases together under one umbrella, much like Dr. Raven was able to bring different diseases under the insulin-resistant umbrella. He's been able to do the same. So I'm going to just show you this. This is a complex slide, and it's biochemistry and so on, but this guy discovered this. It's just amazing. And I just have such respect for people like this who do this. And how do they discover it? So what he discovered, again, please, I apologize for it, but here's the gut. These are two gut cells sitting together. So we all have them. And these gut cells are tightly joined. This is called the tight junction. And they're tightly joined because we don't want food to get in here or proteins to get in here. The intestine is probably, next to the brain, it's the most intelligent organ in the body, because it has to decide what are we going to allow from the gut into the bloodstream through these open pores. And so it keeps these pores tightly closed. Now what happens if you eat gliadin? That applies to everyone in this room. You produce zonulin in the gut, and zonulin then binds to these two receptors. So now here's the one cell, and there's the other cell, and these are the gut, and this is where the food is, and this is the bloodstream is on this side. So food's going to come in here and get absorbed into the bloodstream. Now obviously you don't want anything to be able to get through here unless it's really needed. And that's why the gut is unbelievably intelligent, because it knows what it's going to allow in and what isn't. Now what he showed with remarkable research was that when you eat gluten, you produce this protein zonulin, and it binds to two receptors here. And when it binds, and that's shown now, it binds here, then there's this complex metabolic pathways and signaling occurs. And as a result, the gut opens. And now these tight junctions can allow anything in. Now the problem is each of us has 1 trillion bacteria in the intestine, 1 trillion bacteria. And those bacteria may or may not be good for us. And once those proteins in the gut get into the bloodstream, there's trouble, because the body will recognize it as foreign and produce what we call an immune response. And if the protein here has the same composition as a protein in your body, you will start to attack those proteins in your body that match the protein that you've absorbed. So here's the work that he did, discovering zonulin and its action, and it's published in this journal, Physiology Review 2011. So as I say, this is world cutting edge research. And so what has he said? So he went to look for people with autoimmune disease. And these are all the diseases that didn't exist in the traditional societies eating their meat-based diets or eating traditional cereals before they didn't eat cereals before 1800, but before the grain-based revolution. These diseases were not recognized, and perhaps they didn't exist. So those autoimmune disease, cancers, and certain diseases of the nervous system, he has looked in his patients in Boston for evidence that these people have the leaky gut syndrome, and he's finding it. So his argument is that all these groups of conditions may be related to wheat in the diet causing a leaky gut syndrome. He's not likely to be 100% correct, but I can tell you, as a serious scientist, he would not have put this hypothesis up unless he had really good evidence. And of course it's unconventional, of course it's novel, but novel work is what wins Nobel Prizes. And this is just some of the most astonishing work I've seen in the last few years. And when he lectures, he's one of the best lecturers on YouTube. And if you want to see him, just go and type in Lesya Fasano and go on YouTube. He's just a magnificent speaker. But at one lecture he says, the future of medicine lies within the gut. He says, all diseases begin in the gut. And if that's true, that's an astonishing statement. But guess who said it first? Hippocrates said it first. So here's a man who thinks that wheat is not very healthy for us and that all these conditions may be related to wheat intolerance.